Hi, my name is Johanna Lizarraga, and today I will be examining the reflection assignment. Okay, so the titles are pregnancy, birth, newborn, infancy, early childhood, and middle childhood. I'm going to start off with pregnancy. During my mother's pregnancy, there were no complications. Looking at pregnancy stage during a macro level, I would suggest that the place where she lived and her socioeconomic status compared to living in the United States determined what she experienced and how her pregnancy went. According to the article Human Behavior in a Social Environment, the macro level is the external forces such as economic and political changes. My mother was a tech nurse that worked in a military hospital and came from a middle-class family. During her pregnancy, she did not know the gender, nor did she know how I was growing inside of her. She lived in Lima, Peru, which is in South America. During this time, in the era she lived in, they did not have the medical technologies that we do today. During her time, she believed she was getting the best care possible. During birth, during her time, there was no epidural, which means that she had to go through birthing with feeling everything. But because she was a tech nurse and worked at a hospital, she was able to get better care than others. When I was born, she was able to get assistance from my father, and she had a good support system from the family. We can look at the meso level for this, as she had the support from my father, my grandmother, and her siblings. According to the article Human Behavior in a Social Environment by Sharma and Gupta, the focus is the support system, like family and friends. In the newborn stage, as a newborn, I developed appropriately and had no issues until about 6 months old. I was born in a middle socioeconomic class where my mother had a maid to help her around the house. This allowed her to be with me a lot more as a newborn and dedicated all of her time as she stopped working. She was allowed to stay home with me for about 5 months and a half, where she continued to be paid for this time. Comparing this to family leave that is offered in the United States is ridiculous. In other words, because according to the article in Maternity Leave in Residency, a multi-center study of determinants and wellness outcomes by Stack and others, there is a need for clarity on the laws regarding maternal leave, as it varies depending on organization, whether or not the mother is breastfeeding and the length of how long she chooses to breastfeed. Also, how much time of sick leave or vacation time she has. The average amount of time was 6 weeks. My mother says that in Peru, people who have a career get a lot of time off after giving birth, but also depending on the position that you have. This demonstrates that based on your socioeconomic status, it determines how much time you have with your child. It's almost as if the wealthier you are, the more you get to spend with your child. Infancy. I continue to develop in healthy manner until about the age of 6 months. During this time, I struggled with an ear infection that led me to have a surgery. Looking at this in a more of a micro level, which includes psychological, mental, and physical aspects, I was affected physically and medically, as apparently I stopped eating and became very fragile. Now looking at it in a more macro level, I became very sick and was not diagnosed appropriately. My mother had insurance through the hospital she worked for, which was a military hospital. While that put her in an economic class that was considered a middle class, it was not wealthy enough for her to get the right assistance for me. She shared with me that the director of the hospital referred her to a specialist that was about 2 hours from where she lived. She said that this specialist only saw her because she had a written referral letter from the director of the hospital. Her insurance did not cover this visitation, and she had to pay out of pocket, which she said at that time was a lot of money. I received the surgery and she had to borrow money from the family, which later on led her to having to come to this country. But the doctor did save my life. Early childhood. During my early childhood, which is defined as birth to 8 years, I developed appropriately after the incident of my ear infection. At the age of 2, my mother left me with my grandmother and my father as she came to the United States. My father then left me at the age of 4, and I had to stay and be raised by my grandmother. I'm sure this had an impact in a macro level, as disconnecting with her must have been difficult. I meant micro, I'm sorry. During this time, I went to a private school where hitting was allowed if you misbehaved. I remember they used to do inspections of how clean you are by checking your ears, your socks, and I got in trouble once for not having my socks completely white. My grandmother was called to the principal's office and was told that they had to discipline me by pulling my ear. My grandmother was very upset and threatened them with no longer providing financial support to the school. This shows how having a wealthy social status helps the type of education that you can get, as well as what you can get away with. I was on top of my class and my grade. Because my mother would send money to my grandmother from the U.S., I was able to get a private tutor. I had what my peers would not be able to get. Due to this, I struggled to make friends. At the age of 8, I came to the United States, and entering the school was difficult for me. Coming from a very rigid education, I struggled to understand the culture that I was coming into. The kids would disrespect the teachers, and I couldn't understand it. Not knowing the language, having left my family behind, and adapting to new traditions was more difficult than ever. According to the article by Kuhl from 2014, there is a need to better understand how migrants engage in cross-cultural changes, how they respond and cope with stress and challenges that come from these acculturation processes, and how their coping and adaptation strategies are impacting the health and well-being. I can definitely say that it affected my overall well-being. Middle childhood. According to the article by Giddis, middle childhood is the key transitional stage in the development of attachment process and representation. During this time, I learned to make friends, and I learned a lot about myself. This helped me prepare for my teenage years. I'm an only child who learned to be comfortable with being alone most of the time. My parents allowed me to have friends and to enjoy my time with them. I think I did not have a good connection with my parents at the beginning because mom had left me, and I see that there was that affected me in a negative aspect in my life. Looking in the meso level, I would say that it affected me psychologically, and growing up, I did not have much of a connection with her. And I struggled with loving myself, as I believed that if my parents didn't love me enough to stay, nobody else could. I struggled with being left alone and attachment issues. Thank you.